Hi, my name is Dr. Rob Austin McKee, Professor of Organizational Behavior and Leadership at the University of Houston Downtown, here with mgt.edu, the Open Access Business School. In this video, we'll be discussing individual and group characteristics, including self-perceptions, personality, the person-situation debate, and how individual and group incentives are often at odds. So let's start with this graphic here. On the horizontal axis, we have knowledge in the field. We could refer to that as knowledge, skills, and abilities, competence in any given area. And on the vertical axis, we have confidence. So how competent a person feels. And the graphic initially low, so when you have zero knowledge in the field, you would say your confidence is probably pretty low. I don't know anything about this particular thing. And as an example, we could take, well, I love rock climbing, so like rock climbing. First time somebody walks into a climbing gym or goes climbing outside, they're like, I know nothing. So they have no expectations. But as we see in this graphic, there is a rapid increase from to I know everything, a rapid increase in confidence, feelings of competence, although there has been only a slight increase in knowledge in the field, actual competence. And then we see a steady but slower decrease, and there's more to this than I thought. And then you kind of bottom out like, whoa, this is way more complicated than I thought. And then it starts to make a little bit of sense. And then as you gain more and more knowledge in the field, you realize just how complicated it probably is. So why do we see that precipitous increase in confidence with very little knowledge in the field? Well, let's talk about that left end. What does it represent? If we go back to the readings for this week, which maybe you've done yet, maybe you haven't done yet, does it remind you of anything from the readings? It should. It should remind you of something we call the Dunning-Kruger effect. So that's where essentially the less a person knows about a given area, as long as it's more than none whatsoever, the more confident they feel about their performance in that area. Basically, the less competent a person is, the more competent they feel, as evidenced by their self-ratings in that area. So we are prone to overestimation in a wide variety of areas of life. The important question, obviously, is why does this happen? And that's what I want to explore. So we can look at this graphic here, and within us all, individually, there's this pull between confidence and humility. And these are things that we prize in society at large, right? We like people who are confident, but we also like people who are humble. And these seem to be opposite ends of the same spectrum. Can you be confident and humble at the same time? Some would argue yes, some would argue no. I don't know, but we like them both. We should try to be both. Maybe it just depends on the given area of life that we're talking about. But what we don't like is when we take either of these things to an extreme. When we take confidence to an extreme, we call that arrogance. We don't like arrogance. If we take humility to an extreme, we call that self-deprecation, right? We don't like people who self-deprecate. So we tend to err on one side more than the other when it comes to our self-perceptions. Unless somebody is suffering from depression, for the most part, they're going to err on the side of too much confidence, right? Most of us suffer from some degree of what we would call illusory superiority. So this involves inaccurate self-perceptions, but toward the positive, confident, arrogant side of the realm, if you will. And as evidence of this, some statistics I found, I don't know where these numbers came from, but they're just interesting. And they seem like both at the same time surprising, but also totally believable, that 93% of us feel that we are better than average drivers. Only half of us are better than average drivers if you put half right, average right in the middle. But so that's 43%. That's almost half of us that believe that we're better than average drivers when we're not. And I don't want to leave myself and my profession out of this, but apparently 94% of professors rate their teaching as better than average. Whew. I'm sure that you all sitting in these MBA classes can talk to that. So we tend to overestimate our positive attributes. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? It's nice to have a little bit of that going on. We don't want to fall into arrogance, but it's nice to wake up in the morning and be like, oh, I'm a little bit, better looking than I actually am, or I'm a little bit more intelligent than I actually am, or I'm a little bit better of a rock climber, whatever, than I actually am. It's nice to, it gives us some motivation to get up and go out and face the day, but we can run into some problems with it. As I mentioned before with the graphic that we saw at the very beginning and our callback to Dunning-Kruger from the readings, paradoxically, the most incompetent among us are the most likely to overestimate, while the most gifted may underestimate. So returns to that question, why? Why does this happen? Why are these terribly incompetent people overestimating themselves while the truly gifted are underestimating? Well, when you are incompetent, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know the extent of what you don't know. You just know what you know, and so you're like, well, this doesn't seem that hard, right? Since I got from, knowledge point 0, as we saw in that graphic, the low, you acquire a little bit of knowledge, and at the very beginning, most things are on the easier end, right? And so you're acquiring knowledge very quickly, and you're like, well, this can't be that complicated. And so you truly don't appreciate the depth of knowledge, skills, and ability that it takes to succeed, to truly gain competence within a given area. On the other side of that, why would gifted people underestimate their abilities? Well, if you were a gifted student, say in elementary school, or maybe a gifted athlete when you were growing up, gifted student school came pretty easy to gifted students. If you were a gifted athlete when you were a kid, it came pretty easy to you, right? And so you might reasonably expect that, it should come easy to everybody, just as easy it came to me. So you don't understand the true gifts that you have, and so you may underestimate those things when it comes to your self-ratings of competence within a given realm. Let's take a look at this graphic now and come to some determination as to what this might mean before I just tell you what it means. So it is building on our discussion of confidence and humility, that distinction. We see this gentleman in his own head is on top of the tightrope, successfully balancing, while the girl in her head is hanging on with just one arm, which is actually very hard to do. So kudos to this young lady. She is pretty strong. So this graphic is relating to us the idea that is supported by literature that males are more likely to overestimate their knowledge, skills, and abilities than are females. Females indeed may tend to underestimate those capacities. Why does this happen? We don't have necessarily experimental evidence as to what's going on cognitively or emotionally or psychologically within male and female individuals, but it is likely that socialization plays a role in that, particularly with regard to risk-taking behaviors. Generally, young boys are rewarded for taking risks, while young girls can be scolded for taking similar risks across a variety of cultures. And some of it might be biological, that boys are just more likely to take those risks as a result of elevated levels of testosterone than are females. And so it's probably a bit of nature and nurture. But if there's a lesson to be taken from this, it is that males could generally use a little bit more of the humility side, and females could perhaps use a little bit more of the confidence side. So a few quotes as we get through this section of the lecture. "The fool doth think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool," from Shakespeare. And to succeed in life, you need two things: ignorance and confidence, from our boy Mark Twain. And finally, we're gonna hit our boy K. Lamar. On the one hand, you need to know when to sit down and be humble, right? And maybe that's more on the males than on the females. At the same time, what do you need to do? What's the converse of sit down, be humble? It is stand up, be confident. So know when and where to do each of those two things, and we'll all be a little bit better off. We're going to move on now to the next section of this lecture. We're going to delve into some aspects of personality a little bit here. And what I want to touch on is a follow-up of readings and discussion on Big Five personality indicators. So we remember those: conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, extroversion, and openness to experience, something like that. So I want to know what happens if we take these things to an extreme. Because other than neuroticism, they're all portrayed as being very positive things. And if we flip neuroticism to emotional stability, that's portrayed as being a positive thing. So, when we're selecting employees, if we're giving personality tests to them, conscientiousness, like we want the most conscientious employees possible, right? If it's a sales job, we probably want people who are agreeable, right? People who are nice and considerate. If it is, we want people who are emotionally stable. Of course, certain types of jobs we might select for openness to experience. Hey, this job is going to require you to do a lot of unfamiliar things, be in a lot of unfamiliar environments, engage in creative activities. Are you open to experience? And, maybe if it's a sales job, we also want people who are extroverted. So I want to understand what happens if we take these things and we don't dial them up to just 8 or 9 or 10, but we take them to like 11, right? What does conscientiousness look like if we take it to an absolute extreme? And do we want employees who embody that type of personality? So think about conscientiousness. It's being hardworking, organized, dutiful, all those types of things. Good stuff in a work environment, but at an extreme, it is going to be somebody who is rigid, perfectionistic, probably micromanaging, might be completely unable to trust other people to do a task because they just think they're going to mess up that task. So this good thing taken to extreme is not going to be a good thing when it comes to our employees or indeed ourselves. Let's take agreeableness. So these are people who are humble and warm, considerate, kind. What does that look like if we take it to an extreme? Dial it up to 11. This is probably somebody who's like a pushover, right? Anybody can just go up to the, if this person's a manager, an employee is going to go up and be like, hey, so I got a lot going on right now in my personal life. I'm just wondering if I could take the rest of the day off. And the manager's like, oh my God, oh, sure, of course. Yeah, I mean, well, you got so much going on. And then that employee might be like, well, yeah, I could also take tomorrow off, just make it a long weekend, and maybe Monday too. Would that be okay? And then that person, the boss is like, oh, okay, just take care of your personal life, very important. And then that person's going to go out and tell all the employees, and all the employees are going to go hit up this overly agreeable manager because that person is a pushover. We take openness to experience to an extreme. This is a person who just constantly needs novelty. We've probably all known people who get a new job and they're super excited about it for about 2 weeks, and then they're like, man, I don't know how much longer I can do this. And you're like, but you love this job. And you're like, yeah, but that was like a week ago. I mean, it's a new day, right? New week, new me. So openness to experience taken to extreme, bad thing. Extroversion, what if we take that to an extreme? This is somebody who just constantly needs to be socializing, can't get any work done by themselves because they can't sit still for a few minutes alone. And what's our last one? Emotional stability. If we take that to an extreme, what does that look like? Somebody who maybe seems cold, right? Unaffected by other people's emotions, lacks empathy maybe, or is unable to express it. They're just stable, right? There should be dynamics, there should be peaks and valleys in our emotional lives. When somebody comes and Sally from accounting comes and tells you about her sad cat, and you're just like, well, cats die, all living things pass away. That's not what Sally needs to hear. Sally needs oh my gosh, your cat, I can't believe you had the cat for 22 years. And, she needs a little empathy. So emotional stability taken to an extreme can be a bad thing. So I'm just going to pop that back up really quickly. So let's jump into the dark triad a little bit here. This is decidedly the darker side of personality, the more nefarious side. And it involves 3 traits, at least 2 of which you've probably heard of: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and perhaps psychopathy. Tupac fans have certainly heard of Machiavellianism. So let's jump into what some of these things mean. Narcissism, I know we've all heard of. And it comes from Greek mythology or something. This dude named Narcissus apparently was a pretty good looking dude. And one day was walking by a pond or a pool of water and saw his own reflection in that pool of water and could not stop looking at himself. And he withered away there in that spot, unable to stop looking at himself because he loved the sight of himself so much. And that's where we get this idea of narcissism, self-love, arrogance, sense of entitlement, all these things. So we took this inventory, you got some score and a percentile rank. That percentile rank is where you compare to other people who took that same inventory. So if you're up in the 80s or 90s or something, maybe a more realistic self perception would be of benefit to you. Machiavellianism. So these are people who are manipulative, deceitful. They are willing to, the ends justify the means. That is what we would say about Machiavellianism. They're willing to manipulate other people for their own personal gain. At the same time, they don't trust other people because they think others are trying to do the same to them. And finally, psychopathy. This is people who are very low on agreeableness, shallow emotional responses, low empathy, high stress tolerance, little guilt for doing bad things. They like to have fun, right? They like to live for today. Maybe great people to invite to a party that you're having, but not to hang out with on a regular basis. So again, we got percentile ranks for all of these, so you can see how you compare to the general population who has taken these inventories in the past. I wouldn't put too much credence to the results of this. I mainly had us take the inventory just to introduce the ideas to you and to make our discussion about it a little more relevant, because you can look at your results and be like, oh, cool. So this is stuff we don't necessarily want to do to other people. Interestingly, narcissists don't necessarily mind other people knowing that they're narcissists, because they're like, well, yeah, I am amazing. Of course this test is going to tell me that I think that. Machiavellians definitely do not want other people to know they are Machiavellians, because if other people know that they're Machiavellians, that inhibits their ability to manipulate those other people. So they need to keep that under wraps. And psychopaths, they don't really care. They're just, they don't care what you think of them. They're just there having fun for themselves. So darker side of personality, contrast that with what we were talking about before. And we also took a locus of control inventory. And so you can see if you identified as an internal locus of control or an external locus of control. What are the difference between those two things? Well, people with an internal locus of control believe that they are the primary causal factor of their life outcomes. So if something happens in their lives, they feel empowered to do something about it. They feel empowered to make it happen. If you have an external locus of control, you largely believe that external factors hold sway over the conditions of your life. Being one or the other isn't necessarily better or worse, right? We're not going to make a value judgment and say it's better to be external or internal. It can depend on the circumstances, right? Sometimes having an internal locus of control can make you take responsibility for things that aren't your responsibility, right? Something bad happens in your life that's totally external, and you're like, well, this must be on me, right? Because I control the outcomes of my life. So in that case, an external locus would be better. At the same time, sometimes things happen in your life that are your fault, but that are hard to accept responsibility for. In that case, an internal locus of control is going to be necessary to get you to change that thing, right? So each one holds its holds value given the circumstances. But there are certain implications of internal versus external locus of control that I would like to talk about with regard to something called learned helplessness. Learned helplessness really calls upon our explanatory style when dealing with challenges, difficulties, failures that we encounter in our lives. So in the 1960s, there was a psychologist named Martin Seligman who did some very interesting studies involving canines, dogs, and I'll tell you about the experiments. So imagine that we're researchers and we're doing experiments with a large number of dogs, and we're going to split the dogs up into 3 experimental groups: experimental group A, B, and C. And each one of these groups is going to be put through a different experimental condition. So we have different types of cages that we're going to be putting these dogs in. Dogs from group A get put into this certain kind of cage. This cage has an electric grid on the floor such that the experimenters can administer a mild electric shock to those dogs. And the dogs can go over and flip a switch and stop the electric shock from occurring. So the dogs don't know what the switch does initially, but you administer an electric shock to the dog finds it obviously unpleasant, and the dog will, explore the cage, seeing if different areas are not electrified, and then there's this switch that seems unique with respect to the rest of the cage. The dog eventually flips a switch, the electric current stops, and the unpleasant situation ends. You put those dogs individually in the cage over numerous rounds, and they learn to flip the switch very quickly. Specifically, that's what they learn, but generally, they learn that bad things are going to happen, but I can do something about it. Dogs from group B, we put them in a very similar cage, but this time there's no switch. They just get shocked until the experimenter stops administering the electric shock to the dog. So these dogs learn bad things are going to happen, and I can't do anything about it. Group C dogs, we take them individually and put them into the Group C cage, and nothing happens in that cage. There's no shocks, there's no switches, it's just a cage. That's called a control group. So we put all our dogs individually through several trials with the cages, right? Group A only goes into Group A cage, Group B only into Group B, Group C only into Group C. And then we have a 4th kind of cage. This kind of cage has a partition down the middle, right? Such that on one side of the cage, on the floor, there's an electrified grid, and on the other side, there's just regular floor. There's no switch, just the partition down the middle, and we're putting the dogs initially on the side of the cage with the electrified grid. So we take Group A dogs and put them in this cage one at a time, individually, and administer the electric shock. And what do we expect those dogs to do in this cage? They have learned bad things are going to happen, but they can do something about it. So the shock is administered. There's no switch, so they can't do what they normally do, but they adapt, right? They figure out something they can do, and that is to jump over the partition. Let's skip to Group C dogs, the dogs that didn't learn anything initially because they were just put into a cage. We put those dogs individually into this 4th type of cage. We administer electric shock to the dog, and what's this dog going to do? It hasn't learned anything, but a natural response of organisms is to get away from painful experiences. So eventually that dog is going to jump over the partition also. So Group A dogs, jump over the partition. Group C dogs, jump over the partition. What about Group B? Those dogs that learn bad things are going to happen and they can't do anything about it. We take those dogs individually and put them into this cage, administer the electric shock, and what do we expect them to do? It turns out that a large percentage of them just lay there and take it. They just endure it. They have accepted that they can't do anything about the pain that life continues to confront them with. They have learned to be helpless. And I'm talking about this in this class because I guarantee that has happened to people that we know. I guarantee that it's happened to people in our class, that they have been confronted with a series of difficulties, challenges, failures that they were unable to overcome, and they learned, at least for a while, to be helpless. And I bring it up because we may manage employees that experience a series of failures in life or in the workplace that have taught them to be helpless. And the explanatory style that we have for ourselves, the explanatory style that we can help our employees to develop, has implications for our ability to push through those challenges and failures. So we can look at our explanatory style for a given failure within three realms: how pervasive it is, how personal it is, and how permanent it is. So if we explain our failures as being global, right? This failure represents everything I do in my life, right? It's not just a failure in this one particular realm. It represents my whole life as a failure. That is so much worse. So taking a failure and making it local, realizing this failure applies just to this one thing, is very important. How personal it is. Is it internal versus external? And this goes directly back to locus of control. Did you truly cause that failure? Did your employee truly cause that failure, or were there external factors at play that helped to cause that failure? Again, we want to take personal responsibility when we're involved, but to the degree that we can, realize that external factors were probably involved. And finally, how permanent is it? How permanent is it? Is it stable or unstable? And most of the time, failures are not stable things. They are unstable, right? You are going to gain competence at whatever area of life that failure occurred in. And so the failure is probably not stable. They've done very interesting studies looking at athletes during a post-game press conference, and athletes who use language that is local, external, and unstable go on to have more success than athletes who explain their failures as being global, internal, and stable. So you can take two sports teams and match them in terms of wins and losses, so you are reasonably assured these two sports teams are about equally as good. And again, the ones who use that local, external, unstable language go on to have more success in the future. So this is important for us, for our employees, for our loved ones, that we can use a proper explanatory style, and if we have learned to be helpless, to unlearn that thing. Now let's turn the page again, and we've talked about the person. What I want to talk about now is the environment, or to bring the environment into play and talk about the person situation debate as a cause of our behaviors. So we can look at behavior, noted with a big B here, as a function, little f, of the person or the personality, big P, and the environment, big E. So what are the relative contributions of the person, big P, and the environment, or situation, big E, in determining one's behavior, again, big B? And it turns out that just viewing behavior as a function of the person and environment it's nice, right? It's true, but it's really too simple because there are a lot of moderating and mediating effects that are going on here. And I want to talk through just a few of those so we understand how complicated it is to predict the outcome of selecting certain types of people or making certain environmental changes or making behavioral modifications. It's way more complicated than that. So let's start with this. The effect of the person on the behavior can depend on the environment. Not just a function of the environment, but it can depend on the environment. So if you look at a normal classroom, right, how people are behaving in a regular classroom, the variance of behavior that you will observe in a classroom is typically very small, right? Most students are just sitting quietly, writing or looking on their phones or answering emails or something, right? Very little variance in terms of behavior inside the classroom. Even though there are a wide variety of personality types in that classroom. There are extreme introverts and extreme extroverts sitting in that same room, but they're all acting the same. They're all behaving the same. If we took those same individuals, say, to a party, suddenly we see much more behavioral variance. So the person plays a much bigger role in that environment than it does in the classroom. The effect of the environment on behavior depends on the person. So there is a personality trait called self-monitoring. These are individuals who, or actually self-monitoring is essentially the tendency to walk into a social situation and to try to conform as much as you can, as quickly as you can. So there are people who are high self-monitors, people who go into social situations and just try to blend in as quickly as possible, and people who are low self-monitors, people who go into a social situation and they're like, I'm gonna do me, right? So depending on which personality type you are will influence how much the environment affects your behavior, right? So a high self-monitor is going to walk into an MBA classroom and be like, oh, everyone's sitting up, kind of business casual, tapping on their laptops. So they're going to roll in and try to do that same stuff. Some people roll into the MBA classroom, I've seen them, and they're wearing blankets and Crocs, and they're there to do them. Good for them, right? So effect of the environment on behavior depends on the person. Cool. The environment can shape personality, especially with regard to early life experiences. So did you grow up rich or poor? That actually has a huge effect on who you become later in your life. The person can determine the environment. So it might be that introverted person is never going to go to the party in the first place. So they're never going to have the opportunity for that environment to affect their behavior. Behavior can change the environment. So again, we can look at this within the classroom or the work environment. Sometimes there's just one person who just won't shut up, always has to say some stuff, and changes the environment for everybody else. And yeah, you know who I'm talking about. Behavior can shape the person, perhaps. So this is one of the bases of cognitive behavioral therapy, that maybe you don't need to uncover all the psychological torment that made a person the way they are, starting when they were 5 years old. You just need to say, you have this behavioral tendency, and we are going to address that behavioral tendency regardless of how it developed early on in your life, right? So by just addressing the behavior, we can shape the person. And finally, outcomes of behavior may depend on the environment. Right? So if we look at some professions like athletes, say boxers and NFL players, football players, American football players, soldiers, police, what do those kinds of professions have in common? So NFL players, soldiers, police, what do they have in common? They all can involve committing acts of violence against other people, right? At the end of the day, if we're watching two boxers fight, we're paying them to fight for our entertainment, right? We are paying them to hurt one another for our entertainment. Soldiers, police, at the end of the day, right, in the most extreme circumstances, we as society have authorized them to commit violence on our behalf. And again, there's no value judgment here. Is that good or bad? I don't care. In this context of this discussion, it doesn't matter, right? The value of those behaviors isn't what matters, but you take those same behaviors out of that environmental context, right? You take the boxer out of the ring, you take the soldier out of the uniform, you take the police officer out of the uniform and put them in a room or an elevator with their spouse, and they engage in that same type of behavior, the outcomes are going to be very different. If you go out onto a football field and literally crush your opponent, you can make millions of dollars. You do that to your spouse in an elevator and you're done, right? Your career is done, your life is done appropriately, right? So that's the person situation debate. It's much more complicated than you think. And so if you're a manager trying to unravel this thing and trying to figure out, okay, I want this particular behavior from this employee, you have to realize that there are a lot of intersecting factors going on, and it may not be as simple as just tweaking this one environmental thing. So let's continue this discussion. We're going to look at the Good Samaritan study, which is an interesting study that gets at this distinction between the person and the environment as a predictor of behavior. So in this study, ministry students, okay, at Princeton are told they are to give a speech in a nearby building. We're going to break them up into experimental groups. Half are told that they're going to discuss the Good Samaritan parable from the Bible. So this parable basically extols the values of helping other people, right? It involved a person who was just laying in a roadway, kind of groaning because he was injured, and nobody would help him. And finally, a Samaritan, a good Samaritan, if you will, helped this individual. So half of them are going to be discussing the Good Samaritan parable in a speech they have to give in a nearby building, and the other half are told they're going to be discussing job opportunities for ministry students. We're going to further split up our sample. So we have these two large groups, and a third of each group are told that they are early for that speech. So they've arrived here. Oh, you're early. Take your time getting over there. A third are told that they are just on time. If you go there right now, they should be ready for you by the time you get there. And the final third of each group are told that they are running late and they need to get there post haste. On the way to the other building, each ministry student takes that walk on his or her own, and they encounter a person slumped in a doorway, coughing and groaning, reminiscent of the Good Samaritan parable. So the question is, who will help? Who is going to help this person slumped in the doorway, coughing and groaning, seemingly sick or injured? What will preside, the person or the environment? So if we break this down into the 6 experimental conditions, right? Good Samaritan parable, job opportunities, running on time, running early, just on time, and running late. Do we think that the people who are going to be talking about the Good Samaritan parable will stop and help? Because they have that in their mind, right? Oh, Good Samaritan parable, this guy helped this other guy. And you'd think they'd stop and help the other guy. Maybe it's the people who are going to be talking about job opportunities because they're like, well, I'm going to be a minister and ministers should help people. Is it the people running early? Is it the people running on time? Is it the people running late? Is it all of them? Because they're all ministry students, right? If anybody's going to help somebody, it should be a ministry student, yeah? Who's going to do it? It turns out that, it was pretty much just people who were running early. So if they had the time, they had the will to do it. And everybody else just kind of stepped over this guy like, oh, excuse me, see you're having some difficulty there, don't get in my way. I've got to go give the speech. That's it. So an environmental factor, right, was more predictive of behavior in this case. Let's now talk about Milgram's obedience study. This is a very interesting study done back in, I guess, also the 1960s or something. You can't do studies like this anymore because they're worried that people will get psychologically affected by the studies and never be the same after they do something like this. So let me set this study up for you. We have three roles that are going to be played during this study: an experimenter with the big E, a teacher with the big T, and the learner with the big L. So the experimenter brings two people, two research participants into the lab. The teacher, or rather, just two participants into the lab, and they are going to be assigned randomly as either the teacher or the learner. What one of them doesn't know is that the other one is actually working with the experimenter. They seem to be randomly assigned to the roles, but the person who is working with the experimenter always gets assigned to the role of learner. So the real research participant, the real person we're studying here, is the teacher. Okay? This person doesn't know what's going on. The experimenter and the learner do. So what the teacher is told is that this experiment seeks to determine the effectiveness of administering electric shocks. I know it's a theme in research in the 60s, apparently, to help people learn things. So they're told that the learner is going to learn word pairs, and the teacher is going to test that learner on those word pairs. And when the learner gets an incorrect answer, it will administer a mild electric shock initially, but the electric shock gets more intense over time. So this is actually what the device looked like that the teacher was sitting in front of, and the learner is mostly going to give incorrect answers during this exercise, and it starts off with just a little 15-volt shock. Just and whew, just kind of gets you feeling good, right? A little 15-volt thing just tickles a little bit. And it increases in 15-volt increments all the way to the highest switch, which is 450 volts. So what happens during this experiment is the learner discloses that he has a heart condition. As the electric shocks increase in intensity, the person expresses increasing pain and discomfort, and at some point demands to stop the experiment. And again, this person is an actor, so the person's not actually receiving electric shocks, the person's not actually being hurt, the person is just acting so that we can see how the teacher is going to respond. Now, to their credit, most teachers hesitated throughout the experiment. They say, I don't want to do this anymore, I'm hurting the person, I think something's wrong. The experimenter always responds with something like, the experiment requires you to continue. You must go on. We need to finish the experiment. The experiment requires you to continue. Something like that. So, question. What percentage of participants, this is teachers, went all the way to 450 volts? About 2/3, about 65%. 65% went all the way to 450 volts, and all of them went to 300 volts. And this was a study involving 40 individuals. They were all male between the ages of 20 and 40, something like that. Varied in occupations from working class to managerial jobs. All went to 300 volts, and nearly 2/3 of them went to 450 volts. That should be alarming, right? Because they ostensibly seriously injured this person. There was a point during the study after which the learner stopped responding to the teacher. The person just went silent. And the teacher was like, the person's not responding. The experimenter said the experiment requires you to continue. So they continued to shock what could have been a passed out or even a dead person. The purpose of this study was to see how easily ordinary people could be influenced into committing atrocities. Particularly with regard to what happened in World War II in Germany with regard to persons of the Jewish faith. And it turns out that it might not be that hard to influence ordinary people into committing atrocities. There are some conditions that need to be in place, and that those conditions are that the person giving orders is perceived as qualified and legitimate. In this case, the experimenter seemed qualified and legitimate, wearing a lab coat, perhaps with a clipboard. And the person receiving orders believes the authority will accept responsibility for what happens. And you saw this during the Nuremberg war trials, where a common refrain from people being tried for war crimes after World War II was, I was just following orders, right? And it's easy from our perspective to say, well, I would never do that. But you don't know until you're in that position. You really don't. But we need to be mindful of this. We need to accept that we individually and those around us at least have this capacity if we are to be able to do something to prevent things like that from happening. Let's shift gears now again to discussing conformity. So we discussed obedience over the past few minutes. Let's talk about conformity now. And discuss the Asch conformity experiment. So again, these studies were done probably in the 60s by this guy named Solomon Asch, and he brought several people into the lab simultaneously, say a group of 8 people, and 7 of those people were Confederates, meaning they were working with the experimenter. So again, we just have one person who is the real focus of the study. We are interested in seeing what that one person does, just as we were with the teacher a few moments ago. In this study, the experimenter showed the participants cards like this and asked them, I want to know which line on the left is the same length as the line on the right, or vice versa, right? So are lines 1, 2, or 3 the same length as the other line? And the answer is obviously 1, right? Everybody can see that very plainly. Line 1 is the same length as the line on the other side, right? Yeah? Clearly not. So it turns out that if you do this study on the people individually, basically everybody gets that it's line 3. Easy, right? Almost everybody gets every answer correct. But when you put them in that group setting, suddenly they hear everybody in the group say, it's line 1, it's line 1, it's line 1, it's line 1. And then they get to them, to that person, and that person has this social pressure to go with the group, or do they try to be an individual? And it turns out that the incidence of incorrect answers skyrockets in the group setting as compared to the individual setting. So something like, I think, nearly 40% of the answers suddenly are incorrect when it had been roughly 0 before. So there were some people who always went along with the group. There were some people who never went along with the group. But something like 75% of people ended up going with the group on at least some of the trials. So group pressures, social pressures are incredibly relevant to our lives, workplace, and everything else. So we've talked about obedience and conformity. What are the differences between obedience and conformity? What's the primary difference? Obedience involves some authority figure, right, who is maybe hierarchically above you, whereas conformity is giving into social pressures, namely of your peers. So trying to fit in rather than give in. How do we overcome our tendencies for conformity and obedience? Because we all have those tendencies, right? For some of us, it's stronger than others, but we all have them. How can we overcome them, specifically when it comes to bad behaviors, right? Because conformity and obedience, they have their places. They are of incredible social value most of the time, but sometimes they can entirely derail not just us individuals, but whole societies, whole cultures, whole countries. The way we overcome them is through largely dissent, right? Having somebody stand up against the group and saying no, or stand up against the authority figure and say no. These are experimental variations from Milgram's obedience study. So they ran the study a bunch of different ways to see what variables might increase or decrease the number of people that went all the way up to 450 volts. And indeed, that's what you have on the vertical axis here, the percentage of people administering the 450 volt shock. And on the horizontal axis, you have experimental variations. So you can see a low of like 3% or something and a high of like 92%. So on the low condition, the lowest one, this is where the learner demands to be shocked. So the learner is just like, shock me. And for some reason, the teacher is just like, no. And experimental variation 15 is they have a peer administer the shock. So suddenly they become almost a maybe a de facto authority figure, or at least they're detached from the administration of the shock, so there's some diffusion of the responsibility. What I want to focus on are experimental variations 12 and 14. So in experimental variation 12, you have two authorities with contradictory commands. So there is some dissent present among the authority figures, thus empowering the research participant playing the role as teacher to say no. And experimental variation 14, you have two peers who rebel. So you see two other people who are playing a similar role as you say, I don't want to do this anymore. And that again empowers you to say no because you've seen somebody else dissent. Such a powerful thing. And we've all been in situations where we wish somebody would have stood up and dissented. And unfortunately, that somebody often has to be us as individuals. We have to find the strength within ourselves to defy group pressures or pressures from authority figures when something bad is occurring or about to occur. And let's talk a little bit about individuals versus groups and teams. Incentives are often at odds between individuals and groups and teams. Let's start this off by discussing this activity right here, which you may know as tug of war. So two teams of people get on opposing sides of a rope and pull, and whoever pulls the other team across a certain line, they win. So let's say that we have 8 gentlemen pulling on this end of the rope, okay? Suppose that each man can pull individually with a maximum force of 100 newtons. Okay, so 8 men, each man can pull individually with a maximum force of 100 newtons. What is the total force applied to this end of the rope? Is it going to be 800? Ostensibly it would be. Is it going to be more? Maybe like working together, these men can like overcome their individual limitations and get more out of themselves because they're motivated by each other or something. Dig deep. Or is it going to be less than 800? Because they're going to slack off and be a little lazy because they're like, well, this guy's pulling pretty hard and that guy's pulling pretty hard. Maybe I don't need to pull so hard. Yeah, it's going to be less than 800. It's going to be way less than 800, actually. So they've done a number of rope pulling experiments just like that. And they've done experiments where they have people yell individually and with a group and measure the volume of their yells. And what you see as you add more and more participants to a group task like that is more and more slacking off. So this is a graphic depicting the results of rope pulling experiments, and you can see by the time you get to 8 participants, what should be 800 newtons is now less than 400. So we've lost half of the force that we should have, right? People are slacking off by half. Crazy. So there's a reason I didn't give any group work outside of class, because I remember my days as an undergrad and as an MBA student and just being furious at people who just wouldn't do their work. And I was like, these people are getting the same degree that I'm getting. They're going to go out in the workplace and they are going to devalue this degree that I'm getting because they are such awful people. And I know you've had similar experiences. I know that you are the only one that ever does any work in any group task you've ever been a part of. I know, and I appreciate that. So individual and group incentives are often at odds, right? In these situations, what are you trying to do? You're trying to get the best grade possible for as little work as possible, right? And the more people are added to your group, the more it would seem they could do work. And we also have those issues of illusory superiority. When you ask people to rank their individual contributions to a group task, it usually turns out to be way more than 100%. So if you have a group with 4 people in it, each person's going to say, I did probably half the work. And if each person did half the work, that's 200%. You didn't do 200% of the work. It was only 100% of the work. But everybody thinks they did more than they actually did, and they think everybody else is slacking. And so individually, people don't have as much incentive to work hard in a group setting as in an individual setting. And we have this rational self-interest versus cooperation, something we can refer to as the tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons refers to kind of resources that we all have to share, and would be beneficial if we all showed some restraint in the use of that resource, but we don't trust that anybody else will show restraint, so we're not individually incentivized to show restraint. If we could imagine that we were all shepherds, right? We all have some flocks of sheep, and we all have common grazing land for our sheep. The best thing we could do is to all come together and say, okay, we all have our sheep, and all of our sheep, all of our livelihoods depend on the health of this grazing land, so we need to work together to take care of this grazing land. That would be best case. But we don't really trust each other, right? We don't trust each other. And so you are like, man, Jane, I know Jane's over there just letting her sheep just do whatever they're going to do on that grazing land over there. And John's doing the same thing. Jim's doing the same thing. Jennifer's doing the same thing. I'm going to do the same thing, right? And so the land gets destroyed. That's happening in California right now with water. So there's the water table, and there are a lot of farmers out there. And instead of the farmers planting less water-intensive crops, they're planting the most water-intensive crops possible. They're planting almonds and pistachios. It takes a gallon of water to make one almond. It is incredibly wasteful, but they're able to make a lot of money selling the almonds. And they know that if they don't make that money, their neighbor's going to make that money. And eventually, they're going to run out of water. There are entirely new home subdivisions out there that are totally abandoned because they drilled down the water to a certain level, and the water is no longer at that level. The farmers are paying millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars to increase the depth of their wells because the water table is decreasing like, I don't know, 10 feet a week, I think. Is it 10 feet a week? Look it up. It's very interesting stuff. It is absolutely tragedy of the commons, and yeah, individual group incentives. Let's take another look at the bad side of that, social loafing, the slacker phenomenon. Again, I didn't put you into groups particularly for this reason. So this is a phenomenon wherein a person exerts less effort when working in a group than when working alone. So that's what we call that phenomenon, social loafing or being a slacker. And let's also look at this through the eyes of an economic thought experiment called the prisoner's dilemma. So let's imagine that we have two partners in crime arrested, and they have no means of communicating. So they're in different interrogation rooms at the police station. And the police don't have enough evidence to convict both on the main charge, but they can sentence both on some lesser charge. So the police offer each prisoner a choice as to whether or not to confess to the principal charge. So if you confess, we'll go easy on you, right? The other person will take the big ride, and you will have to do a short little stint, but we'll go easy on you. We end up with something like this. So in orange, we have prisoner A, and in blue, we have prisoner B. Each one is given the option to confess or to remain silent. And we can look at the different outcomes, what would happen if, they both remain silent. That is, like your ride or die type homie. Snitches get stitches type of thing, right? Don't snitch, you just stay quiet, you lawyer up, we both do a little ride, and it's all good, right? So 2 years each in that case. And that's what they're supposed to do. If they both confess, if they both try to take the deal, they both get 5 years. They both get charged on the principal charge. Not so good, right? 5 years is worse than 2 years. But the really interesting parts happen on the other diagonal. So where one person remains silent, ride or die, snitches get stitches, and the other person snitches. They risk the stitches. Why does that happen? Why would one person remain silent, the other person not remain silent? Why would either of them confess? Largely trust. Because if you are sitting there, do you really trust that other person is going to be silent? Because if you look at the payouts on the other diagonal, where the person that remains silent gets hit with a 9-year bid, and the person who snitched gets out after 6 months, man, that is risky. If you are staying silent, you are risking a 9-year bid based on the trust that you put into that other person. So you really have to sit there and say, do I trust this person? So what should have just been 2 years each can easily turn into 5 years because the person doesn't want to risk 9 years. So let's imagine a scenario, maybe even in the classroom, right? Imagine that a professor, imagine that I gave you the opportunity to contribute points from your course grade to a common pool. Let's say that at the end of the semester, the average course grade was an 80 or something. That means some people are going to have, maybe somebody has 100, somebody else has a 95, a 90, and there's some people who have like 60s and 50s, terrible course grades. But I'm saying that the average is an 80, and I will allow everybody in the class to contribute points from their final course grade to a common pool that I will increase by 20% and redistribute evenly. So if the course average was an 80 and everybody gave all their points, I increased that by 20%. That takes us to a 96. Yeah, 96. That means everybody gets a 96. That's pretty good. Everybody gets an A. But any points not contributed to the common pool are retained by the individual. So that means that after everything in the common pool is increased by 20% and redistributed evenly, you add that to what you kept before, and that's your final grade. So you have to think, oh, we could all do this, right? The group, what's good for the group is for everybody to give everything, and it'll be increased by 20%. We all get an A, walk away at the end of the day, everything's great. But are you going to trust those other individuals in the classroom to do the right thing? Are you going to trust that person with the 50 to be like, yeah, I'll give up all 50 of my points? Are you going to trust the person that has 100 to be like, I already have 100, why would I lower my grade? And what's the best case scenario here from an individual perspective? And what's the worst case scenario from an individual perspective? The best case scenario from an individual perspective is that everybody else gives everything they have and it gets increased by 20% and redistributed evenly, and you kept your entire initial pool. Because your contribution to the common pool, it doesn't make that much of a difference, but you can basically double your points, maybe triple your points by playing the game that way if everybody else gives everything they have. The worst case scenario from an individual is for you to be the only fool that gave up everything you have because you trusted everybody else would. And so you give up your 80 or your 100 and it gets increased by 20%. So if you have 100, now it's 120, and it gets distributed among a class of 40 people. So everybody gets like a 3. So you went from having 100 to a 3. Because you trusted everybody. Again, trust is going to tear this apart. What could have been great for everybody turns out to be mediocre, potentially disastrous for most people, or and individual. I'll leave us with this thought here about group work. When I die, I want the people I did group projects with to lower me to my grave so they can let me down one last time. Thanks for watching the video. I'll see you next time.